As well.
Broken hearts and broken wings, bring it all, everything, and bring the song you fear to sing. All is welcome here. And even if you broke your vow 1,000 times, come anyhow. We're stepping into the power of now, and all is welcome here.
My name is Barbara Larrabee. This is my presentation that's basically covering parts of my thesis entitled Reclaiming the Sacred Heart of Healthcare, Celebrating Spiritually Integrated Heart Failure Management. The song that you just heard is by Deva Premal and Miten. They are what is known as kirtan artists. That music is in the public domain. If you Google Deva Premal, All Is Welcome Here, you can pull up that song. This first stanza is the very beginning of my thesis. Broken hearts and broken wings, bring it all, everything. Bring the song you fear to sing, all is welcome here. Even if you broke your vow 1,000 times, come anyhow. We're stepping into the power of now, and all is welcome here. And I chose this particular song, this particular stanza, because that's really what I wanted to say about my thesis. It doesn't matter where you are in the continuum of feelings or interaction with the Western biomedical model in the United States, or where you are in the continuum of spirituality, whether you are living an intentionally devotional life, or you are strictly a materialist, or consider yourself an atheist, it doesn't matter. Because what I have to say to you can apply to everyone in any situation, and it's all welcome here. So I came to this partly because I've been in healthcare for a long time, and I've also considered myself to be a spiritual person, a spiritually living person for a really long time. But what I found is there are inherent successes and deficiencies in both the Western biomedical model and established spiritual belief systems. And it occurred to me that when something doesn't fit, but it's important, and you don't want to just get rid of it, you can resize it, or you create a new paradigm. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a little resizing and creating a new paradigm. It also occurred to me that if you're not being fed where you are, you can either find a place that does feed you, or you can learn how to feed yourself. And I didn't want to leave healthcare, and I didn't want to leave my idea of a spiritual life. And so I had to figure out, how am I going to feed myself in this particular situation? So I'm going to do just a very brief tutorial about cardiac anatomy and heart failure. Promise it's brief. This part that says very, very, very basic, this is why I went into nursing and not the MFA program. If you took someone's heart and you cut it in half, top to bottom, and you open it up, it looks something like this. So just in case everyone's not familiar with this, so our heart is divided into a right and a left side, 2 top chambers, 2 bottom chambers. Blood comes from the body into the right atrium, gets squeezed into the right ventricle, gets squeezed out into the lungs where that oxygen-carbon dioxide exchange takes place. Blood comes back from the lungs into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, and gets squeezed out into the whole rest of the body. This is the left ventricle that we're really talking about when we talk about heart failure. And this chamber has a lot of work to do, so the walls are pretty thick and beefy because they work pretty hard. So my guess is that nobody in this room is prepared to offer me a very succinct, immediate definition of heart failure. So if you do, I'm going to follow. That's okay. Because here's the true definition of heart failure. It's a condition in which the heart's ability to supply the body with blood and nutrients is outweighed by the body's metabolic demands. This is important because it points out that not all heart failure is because there's something wrong with the person's heart. For example, people who do methamphetamine not infrequently show up in the emergency room with overt acute heart failure, and their heart is perfectly normal. But they've increased their metabolic demand so much that their heart really just can't keep up. Eventually, that does damage people's hearts. It's caused by problems with squeezing. So instead of squeezing really vigorously and uniformly to pump blood, the heart motion becomes something more like this. And that discrepancy is not an exaggeration. You can actually see that on heart ultrasound or echocardiogram. Or it can be a problem with thinning. So if this chamber gets thick and stiff and it doesn't expand very well, no matter how much blood flow is trying to come into this ventricle, it's only going to hold a certain amount. It's not going to hold anymore. It starts backing up, backs up into the left atrium, and then it backs up into the lungs, and people get very short breath. Also, valve problems can cause heart failure. Problems with any of these little circles, there are valves here, either not opening properly and allowing a sufficient amount of blood through, or not closing properly, so that when the chamber contracts, blood actually shoots back the opposite way, which decreases cardiac output. The primary symptoms of heart failure are shortness of breath, swelling, fatigue, weakness, eventually multiple organ dysfunction. Treatments include reversing the cause, like don't do meth, or treating coronary artery disease, those things. Reversing or slowing what's called ventricular remodeling, which is what happens when the heart cells mutate into cells that don't work very well anymore. That's what it's called. We do that with medications, which, by the way, we did not have at the beginning of my nursing career. So our ability to actually treat this disease is brand new in the last 30 years. We also use device therapy, implanted artificial heart pumps that are called ventricular assist devices, or ultimately with heart transplant, which is the cure for heart failure. It gives people a whole host of other things, but they don't have heart failure. So what's so unique about heart failure management that I would take the trouble to even talk about this? Well, one is the stakes are really high. You've got one heart, its job is to keep you alive. This is a really bad thing wrong with that heart. 50% of people diagnosed with heart failure still die within the first 5 years. And heart failure has a very unusual trajectory compared to other disease processes. This is, again, a very crude illustration of this. But the top of this chart is life. The bottom of this chart is death. In average life expectancy, people are healthy, healthy, healthy. As they get older, perhaps they have a little bit of loss of function, and eventually they die. That's kind of a normal average life expectancy. In cancer, and of course, I'm talking generalities, I'm not talking specifics here. People are normal and healthy, they get very sick, we treat them, they kind of hit a plateau, and one of two things will happen. They'll get better, and they'll resume pretty much their normal state of health and function, or they die. In heart failure, that is not true. People are healthy, they take a big tumble, they often are very sick on presentation, which is part of the reason why 50% of people die in 5 years, because a lot of them die in the first week. We treat them, they get a little better, they come up, but maybe not quite to their baseline. They hit a little tumble, maybe they get bronchitis, and they get quite a bit worse, and we treat that, and they get better again, and then maybe they have a series of things happen. Maybe they break a hip, maybe they have a little head injury from a fall or something like that, and they kind of stutter along a little bit, and maybe they plateau a little again, and then one of two things will happen. We either move on to advanced therapies, like ventricular assist device, or people die. But this trajectory is very different from these, and it makes this disease process extremely difficult to predict, and extremely difficult to treat, and extremely difficult for patients to navigate. The other thing that makes this unusual is that the advanced therapies that we have for heart failure, they're extreme, and they carry significant risk. Patients can be eligible for advanced therapies until they're not. Until they have what might be a relatively small event, they have a small stroke, or we do the final EKG before they get listed for transplant, and a nodule shows up in their chest. So you can't transplant somebody that has cancer, because you have to put them on immune suppressant drugs, and basically you're committing them to a death sentence from cancer when you do that. And then maybe they are again. I had a patient who we referred to for advanced therapies, and they said, well, you're not going to get a transplant because you're too sick, you've got too many other things wrong with you, and we're not going to put a ventricular assist device in because you've got too much peripheral vascular disease in your legs. They worry about clots and things like that. Well, we're just going to send you home on hospice. And then a surgeon walked in and he said, I think I can fix the problem in your legs. Don't give up. Believe in me. And he did. He fixed her legs, and she got a ventricular assist device, and 4 months later she got a heart. And she's doing extremely well right this minute. So if you can imagine from the patient's perspective what that's like, literally in the span of an hour, she went from a hospice patient to potentially curing her heart failure. And by the way, that's not all that easy for us either. So treating heart failure requires a lot of special education, skill, not everybody can do this, experience, nimbleness, flexibility, adaptability, and emotional resilience. It's also helpful, a foundation of comfort with uncertainty, change, and death is required to maintain our stamina over a career, a 40 or 50-year career of treating people who have this highly unpredictable disease. But really, it's a lot about love. And love is the foundation that allows us to remain open-hearted and resilient in this situation where from day to day we really don't know what will happen with our patients. I had a patient in a heart failure class as we were talking about the anatomy and physiology of heart failure and going through all these grim statistics, and she stood up in the class and said, listen, the most important part of my heart isn't failing at all. The most important part of my heart is working just fine. And I use this now in every class I teach. So most of us are at least familiar with the term spirituality. But if I asked you right now for a definition of spirituality, it might be a little bit difficult for you to come up with something in a hurry. So as I was writing this paper, I decided that I was going to define spirituality for myself and for you within the context of my paper. So this is kind of what my definition looks like. Spirituality is things that are intangible, but they still have meaning. It can be the connection between humans. It can be connection to the divine source, or maybe we would identify it as the divine source. It might be religious, and it might not. Not all spirituality is religious, and not all religion is spiritual. Spirituality can give us meaning and purpose. Some synonyms are compassion, divinity, altruism, justice, and love. So in my definition, spirituality is the thing that we're talking about. Religion is the story that we tell about the thing. We're going to talk more about story. But really, it's just a lot about love. So this is my thesis statement. The subspecialty of heart failure management is an ideal template for spiritually integrated healthcare and spiritually integrated living. Because if this work only applied to people who manage heart failure for a living, then it really wouldn't have felt like it was worth all the work that I put into it. But the truth is, what I'm talking about here can be applied to anybody in this room, or anybody in general. So as I started writing, I needed to write myself a little note to sort of keep me grounded and focused. This is a big, huge topic that I'm sort of condensing down into a relatively small paper. So the focus needs to be on the positive, always on the positive. The work should challenge commonly held beliefs without blame or recrimination, always offering the solution that serves everyone. So I didn't want this to be a paper that indicted the Western biomedical model, and I didn't want it to be a paper that indicted spirituality. But once in a while, you find that you get in the weeds when you're writing a paper, right? So just in case, when I got to those times where I was a little off track, this sticky note is on a picture. It sits right next to my desk where I write. It's the love, stupid. You notice the Goddard sticker that one. So the introduction to my thesis initially is basically an invitation. It's inviting all of you with all of what you have to come into this conversation with me. What I would say to healthcare providers is we do not have to choose. We've been taught all our careers that if you want to be a good healthcare provider and you want to provide evidence-based care and best practices and all of that, you have to leave all that spiritual stuff, all your personal stuff, outside the exam room. And that is a lie. And we don't have to keep telling that lie. The next part is really about who I am and my location in the universe. You know, like middle-aged, well, I am still middle-aged. White living in the United States. And then I outline some of the core beliefs that have informed my work. Because I'm talking about some pretty intensely intimate and personal things here, and I think you all have a right to know what my biases are. So I just called those out. And then I described the layout of my thesis, which is essentially in 3 sections. And I'm going to talk more about those in just a minute. And there's a big discussion about the power of the stories that we tell. So I already sort of pointed out that, you know, in my paradigm, spirituality is the thing we're talking about. Religion is the story that we tell about that. And this is a big theme throughout my thesis because I'm really intrigued about those stories that we tell. So while you all are sitting here listening to me talk, you're telling yourself a story about what's happening in here. Maybe you like what you hear, maybe you don't, maybe you wish you could take a nap. Maybe you're thinking about your own presentation this afternoon, but there's some kind of story that's going on in your head. It's our internal conversation. And what's interesting to me about those internal conversations is that none of them is precisely the truth. So our stories can be beautiful and empowering and challenging and intriguing and a whole lot of things. And they can also be cruel and demeaning and mean and those kinds of things, but none of them is precisely the truth because it all gets filtered through us, through our personalities and our experience and our location in the universe and our cultural biases and all that stuff, and then we turn it into a story. And there's not something wrong with that. What I'm suggesting here is that if we're aware that we are telling a story that is maybe not 100% true, then we can make some decisions about what kind of story we want to tell, and whether that particular story really serves us very well. And of course, there's a section in here that says why it's really just about love. If we didn't do anything else and we just talked about what does it mean for us to love each other, really, as a verb, actively, every day, we could just forget the whole rest of it. So part one of my thesis, why spirituality and why heart failure management. There are 3 chapters in this section. Making the case for spiritually integrated healthcare. There's actually an abundance of research that spirituality, yes, does belong in the Western healthcare model. And then why heart failure management, why it's an ideal template for spiritual integration. So all of those things that I talked about in the beginning that make this hard for us as clinicians and providers of care to people with heart failure are all the reasons of why we need our spiritual base to be part of our practice. We need it to be able to keep doing this. And our patients need it from us. They need us to be humans. They need to connect with us. Patients tell me all the time, I will pray for you. Yes, do that. And I had one person who was dying, and she said, I promise, I will pray for you when I get there.
Oh,
And yeah, so that sunk right into the heart of my heart. And the 3rd chapter is, where is the evidence? So let's look again at why should we be doing this specifically in heart failure management. And again, there's plenty of evidence about why we should be doing that. Part 2, up close and personal, is exactly what it sounds like. This is the section where, any of you know Hanuman, the monkey god, who takes his chest and rips it open, and there is his beautiful heart and Sita and Ram, his parents, sitting inside. And that's kind of what I did here, is you know, I'm out there exposed, really, and showing you all my heart in this part. So this first chapter, God is in the waiting room, basically asks the question, how would we interact with one another? How would we interact with our patients if we believed that the person in front of us is a manifestation of the divine? And by the way, how would we interact with those people if we believed that about ourselves as well? That can change everything. The second chapter, managing heart failure when your tank is empty, or what do you do when the mojo isn't working? So this chapter was actually written for a pretty obvious reason, right? I'm in the middle of writing this humongous thesis on this topic that is my passion and pretty much my life's work to this point. And I kind of get to a point where I'm like, God, you know, I kind of got nothing right now. And what am I going to do? Because I have deadlines. I have a paper that's due in 3 days. And so this chapter really just says that. You know what? It happens to people. It kind of happens to all of us, no matter what profession you're in or how much you love it. You kind of hit this place where you're like, wow, like when did this happen? So this is my journey out of that, really. It's some details about my personal practice and some specific meditations that I did and some days that I spent in mindfulness and what my experiences are. And they will not be what your experiences are. The practices that I use or that work for me probably won't work for you because they are unique to me. But what my goal with this was to say, it's okay. You don't have to be afraid of this. And there's a way out, and you just use what you have. I'm going to show you how I use what I have, but you have your own tools. Part 3 is expanding the perspective, or sort of just that, kind of expanded this conversation a little bit, directly from heart failure management into a little bit of a larger venue. So the first chapter is healthcare, heart failure management, and social justice in America. it was pointed out to me that this chapter really needs to be about love. I was a little tempted, you see, to make it about something else, talking about social justice in America right now. So this chapter really looks at things like wealth disparity in the United States and how that directly correlates to health disparities. And the idea that if we don't take care of people who can't care for themselves, we still pay. We can pay on the front end or we can pay on the back end, but we're still going to pay, and wealthy people are going to pay too. Because it costs money not to do the right thing. One of my certifications is in case management, and the credo of RN case management is the right care is the least expensive care. If you do it right the first time and you don't have to do it again or take care of a mess or something that got broken because you didn't do it right the first time, it's a lot less expensive. So if we need to talk about dollars and cents, we can do that, but we don't have to talk about dollars and cents. We can just talk about what's right. What's the right thing to do? And that, of course, has massive implications in healthcare, looking at the Tuskegee study and some things that the United States healthcare has done. But also within heart failure management. So our patients need to be on a combination of medications. Not all of them can afford those medications. So we have a potential treatment for a disease that used to be just completely fatal. And now people can't afford that care. So what do we do with that? The second chapter is thanatophobia. I got to tell you guys, I'm in love with this word, right? It's just such a cool word. It's an unnatural fear of death. And so in this chapter, I really take a long time to look at our cultural and social relationship with death and dying. And not just physical, material death, but also ego death that ties into our insistence on eternal youth and eternal beauty and our resistance to any loss of function in any way. We just don't want to accept that. And that has created, it has helped to create a healthcare system that doesn't serve us and it's not sustainable. And one of the things I think we need to change is that we need to be talking about those things with people from the very beginning, not when they're sick and we just handed them a piece of paper that says, by the way, we think you're going to die of this. This is the number to call hospice. The final chapter in my thesis, Soul Naked and Unafraid, Final Thoughts on Spiritually Integrated Living. This is a chapter where I sort of looked back through the whole rest of my paper and found little bits that didn't really get addressed as well as I would like, or things that I kind of forgot, but it didn't feel right to go back and completely rewrite entire chapters. And so I kind of scooped them up into this final chapter. So that is a piece of it. A big piece of it revolves around one conversation I had with a colleague of mine who is now a retired pediatrician. If any of you saw the video from my undergraduate presentation, he's the pediatrician featured pretty prominently in that video. So we're having dinner, and he's asking me about my work, and I'm, kind of going on and on about where I am, and that I have been interviewing providers and asking them, so how does spirituality show up in your practice right now? And met some resistance that I was not really expecting from people. And he just interrupted me and said, you're asking the wrong question. The question you need to ask is, how are we sacred to one another in healthcare? That changed everything for me. And then he went on to talk about what he thinks that looks like, right? So what he says to me is, how we touch a patient is a sacred act. when you touch a patient, it's an act of consecration. How we dress is a way that we are sacred to one another in healthcare. And you know that there's power in our dress. And not necessarily saying that, you know, men need to wear suits and ties and women need to wear dresses and nylons and high heels, but that things like the stethoscope, the tie, the white coat, those are ornaments of our profession, and they are sacred, or they can be sacred in that particular relationship. And maybe you don't know this, but healthcare has gotten pretty informal. So some of the docs that I've worked with, you know, they kind of wear ragged jeans that drag on the bottom and Birkenstocks and t-shirts. And I'm not really saying that that's not okay. What I'm saying is there is something about the sacrament of dress and the sacrament of mannerisms that change that patient interaction. So if we see it from the standpoint of how are we sacred to one another, that kind of changes how I feel about how we dress too. So what do you do in your world to make it sacred? Because again, this is just about healthcare. All but like 2 of you can get up and leave. So how are you sacred to one another as educators? How are you sacred to one another in business? How are you sacred to one another in mindfulness practice? Right? So if you are a retail salesperson, you know, maybe you make all your transactions fair. Maybe you do what you said you were going to do. You deliver on time. There are a lot of ways that we can think about to be sacred to one another. And if you work at McDonald's and your job is to sweep the floor, making sure the floor is clean is a sacred act. And if you're the person flipping burgers, you know, that is a sacred act in making sure that the meat is good, that you do it exactly the way you're supposed to do it, that nobody's goofing around with the food and all that kind of stuff, right? So there are lots of things that can be done, and that's also part of the conversation in this paper. And then there's the afterward. This is the part I didn't intend to write. So 2 weeks before my final semester here, my sister was diagnosed with a metastatic brain tumor. And she was admitted to, I'm sorry you guys, she was admitted to the neurotrauma ICU in Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So you know when we jokingly say things like, it's not brain surgery, okay? This is brain surgery that they're doing, okay? And we had a lot of time to sit and observe the care that my sister got and the care that other patients and other families received there in the hospital. And I sat back and went, holy smokes, they're doing it. They're doing it. Everything that I'm writing about in this paper, they're doing it right here. If they can do it in the neurotrauma ICU, which is kind of by definition the most technical unit in the hospital, we can do it. We can all do it. If they can do it there, we can do it in advanced heart failure clinics. Right? And you can do it too. Why we should pay attention to this? They deliver extremely good care. Their outcomes are extremely good. What I would like to do is find out who else is doing it. Because this was like a gem that I found in a most unexpected place and a most unexpected time. So I think there are other people who are doing it too. I'd like to hear from them. I would like us to talk to each other about this. Because the more conversation we have, the more permission those other people have to let go of the idea that we have to be one or the other, that we cannot safely combine these two things. And in the end, it's really just about love. So what's next? So I wrote this paper. Really, I wasn't kidding when I said this is my life's work up to this point. This has been my passion and my drive for a whole lot of years. So there's an answer to this question. After a whole lot of editing, it's now good. And this was part of my learning process as well. On the advice of some published authors, I made a decision to self-publish for a couple of reasons. One person said to me, if you know what you want to say, don't be afraid to self-publish. And another reason is time. One of our previous cohorts has a book that she thought was ready to go, and she still is not out anywhere. And this is a year later. It needed to happen. So part of my learning process was, how do you do that? And the process of formatting a manuscript into a book form was something I really had not anticipated being quite so complex and taking quite so much time, but it's doable. It really is doable. I have a website, www.thesacredheartofhealthcare.com. My address, my email address, I love this, is barbara@thesacredheartofhealthcare.com. And there's also a Facebook page. I would love to hear from you. Yes or no, positive, negative, you stink, you know, I love it. I would still love to hear from you, so the invitation is open. Woo! So does anybody have any questions, or you want to just break early?
The cover of your book, that's a very good picture of a half a heart, is that correct?
Of a half a heart, yes. It's not really a very good picture, but
Better than the one you drew.
that's not really saying much.
So the neurological unit that you found to be extraordinary, did you come to understand how it was that they had created that environment?
Thank you for asking that question. Not entirely, although I happen to know that the CEO of that hospital is now in possession of a copy of my book with a cover letter that says, by the way, your unit is mentioned in the afterword of this book. But here's why I think they can do it. One reason, there are nurses on that unit for whom spirituality is extremely important. I only know that because I asked them, not because it was overtly obvious, but I recognized that in them and said, are you like doing this on purpose? Do you see what you're doing here, and are you doing it on purpose? And they went, oh yeah. I think, do you want to answer?
I was just going to say, I work for the health system. I'm the daughter of a patient. But one of the things that's true about where I work is they give us the time and the resources and the staff to provide excellent care to every patient every day. That's like the core of our mission, and we're still a nonprofit hospital, and in most places across our health system that is true.
So thank you for that, because the one thing that I wanted to point out about that is that it's all about time. Every provider I know would deliver that kind of care if they had enough time. And every medical institution, maybe except for that one, that I'm aware of, the time that we actually have to deal with patients is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking.
We're actually trained when we work in the hospital at my system to say to patients before we leave the room, is there anything else I can do for you? I have the time.
Right, so as a patient, that feels pretty great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would feel like really sick if someone said, yes.
Do you have these conversations with your colleagues at work, or what happens at work?
Oh, yes, from a colleague at work. So it's interesting because when I was in primary care and I opened this conversation, the first thing someone said to me is, well, that'll be a really short conversation. But it wasn't. I had like 12 hours of interviews with people. When I tried to have that same conversation in the cardiology unit where I work, where, by the way, I happen to know that people do deliver that kind of care because I see it every day. They're like, oh no, not me, man. I just deliver evidence-based care and we go on best practices. And, not me, not me. Which I found really just remarkable because I was like, wait a second, you're totally doing it. So what is that? Which was how that conversation started with the pediatrician. It depends, is I think my answer. Most of my colleagues were pretty supportive of me when I wanted to interview them, and they gave me a lot of really good information. One of the doctors that said, oh no, not me, never, never, also made a statement. The patient is all hoping. So that's the place that he actually comes from, even though he says he's not spiritual. I mentioned this to a doctor that does locums work for us, a doctor that I actually consider to be very good at what he does, and he burst into laughter and laughed way past the point at which it had become overtly rude, and past the point where I walked out of the room and into my office and closed the door. What was that?
Denial too strong there.
So here's the thing, he's a locums, he's a lawyer.
Yes, too much.
Do you see yourself potentially, like I'm doing a CPE, the Certified Pastoral Education thing in our local hospital, and it's like the medical world is like, ooh, we need to bring the student chaplain in for this. Like, could you be doing this in medical schools, as part of the curriculum? For
I think that would be lovely.
versus it being handed off to the student chaplain who really has no relationship, or like all, I mean, not to dismiss that at all.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility, and I think they are doing some of that now, but it's sort of buried under that massive weight of other stuff. Yeah.
It would be great to get in touch with Pam Hall, used to be MFAIA faculty. She did a whole year of training in this kind of thing at her hospital in Toronto. And she was, asked by the Canadian government to do more of that. And it'd just be interesting to find out to what extent Canada is deep in this
Yeah,
or not.
you can give me her name.
Yeah, sure.
By the way, I promised to pass this on to you in case you don't know, Shakti's presentation at 2 o'clock is not in the clock house, it's in the hay barn. So you just have to walk down the hall. Yes.
Barbara, love you, love this. What resonated with me was the part where you were talking about these conversations and lead to people giving permission to themselves. What is your experience, or what are your thoughts on that interaction? giving ourselves permission.
To be spiritual.
Right, to follow our hearts.
I'm not really sure how to answer that because I don't actually think you need my permission. But if you do, I'm giving it to you right now.
Right. No, I mean, when we give ourselves permission, and that's not necessarily based on a conversation with someone else, giving us permission, what are some avenues for that?
So what I think that means is that we don't have to compartmentalize things. If you're a scientist, science does not have to be non-spiritual. That's nonsense.
Right.
And there's actually a piece in my thesis that talks about that. There's a whole field of neurobiology and neurotheology where they kind of explore the idea that everything we think and feel is really just a result of chemical reactions. So here's what happened in that group of people doing that research. So they're all kind of looking at the same research, or they do research and they all get the same result. And this group of people says that is proof that God does not exist and this is all just chemicals, and when we die, that's just it. But another group of researchers looking at the same data says that is absolute proof that we are hardwired to experience God. And given the choice, I know which category I fall in, right? So people can argue that if you believe in science, you can't believe in something divine, but other people will argue very strongly and as eloquently in exactly the opposite way.
So we get to
Did
pick.
that answer your question at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm so happy to see you.
I just want to say this is so wonderful for the world and so important. And I had a question, just like the doctors who would, laugh in your face are the ones who'd say like, no, we can't talk about things like that. Did you try like swapping words, leaving the word spiritual out and talking about compassion or love, or does anything work better than others?
I think that it can.
Uh-huh.
I did not. So
Yeah, and
the other-
also, right, is it just watering it down and forget swapping words?
Yeah, the other thing that's important here is that most of those conversations are happening in the hallway, like while we're both on the way to go do something. So they were mostly short conversations. And I guess this is important to say too. When I encounter people where I say, like patients, is there a spiritual belief system that we should know about that might impact your care? And they say, nope. Then we're done talking about it. We're not going to talk about it again. But that person also knows now that if they want to, they can approach me about that. So the people go, stay away from me. That's okay. I can do that. But changing the words, yeah, that might hurt.
Or maybe just waters the whole thing down and never mind. I'm just curious how much you played with that, if you got like pushback on some. Oh, can I take words that I can use in a sense to stand in for the values of what I mean by spiritual and use those words instead?
You're going to help me with that part.
Okay.
Well, in your book, you talk a lot about compassion and love.
Yes. Yes, we can talk about compassion as well. That's a little easier. Yeah. And the other technique that I use is I compliment people on the things that I think they do really well. So one of those people I mentioned is really, really good at having the end-of-life conversation and basically says, listen, cardiologists tend to have really big egos, and when our patients don't do well, we feel like we fail. And I don't want to feel like that about you, but I don't have anything else to offer you except to take really good care of you in the last part of your life. And that's a pretty good conversation. Let's do it. So, it doesn't have to be about God. Shocked would be mad at me if I was